Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, einer alten Tradition folgend werde ich unseren heutigen Jensen-Gastprofessor in Deutsch vorstellen. Freut mich, dass Sie so zahlreich erschienen sind. Möglicherweise war es auch wegen dieses Fotos. Ich glaube, ich muss da ein Missverständnis erstmal aufklären. Ich bin nämlich verschiedentlich gefragt worden. Wir haben leider vergessen hinzuzufügen, um wen es sich dabei handelt. Und ist es der Vortragende, ist es nicht der Vortragende? Nein, also einige von Ihnen werden ihn erkannt haben. Es ist tatsächlich nicht der Vortragende, sondern es ist Max Ernst. Und wie Sie wissen, war Max Ernst ein begeisterter Sammler von Ethnographika und vor allem spezialisiert auch auf die Kachina-Puppen der Hopi. Die sind leider auf der Grafik nicht so richtig gut rausgekommen. Sie sehen sie da oben links, ne? Das ist Kachina. Ja, und darin besteht jetzt eben auch der Bezug zu unseren Jensen-Vorlesungen in diesem Semester. Professor Richland hat lange und intensiv bei den Hopi gearbeitet, dort Feldforschung betrieben, aber nicht nur Feldforschung, sondern praktische Arbeit, und ein großer Teil seiner juristischen Tätigkeit bei den Hopi bestand darin, genau für die Rückgabe dessen auch Sorge zu tragen, was wir hier im linken oberen Bildrand sehen, nämlich die Kachina-Puppen, die schon seit vielen Jahren von amerikanischen Museen zurückgegeben worden sind an ihre ursprünglichen Eigner, nämlich an die Hopi. Professor Richland hat einen für einen Ethnologen ungewöhnlichen Lebenslauf. Er kommt nämlich direkt aus der Praxis. Er hatte, bevor er sich für die Ethnologie entschied, Recht studiert an amerikanischen Universitäten, war eine Zeit lang auch als Rechtsberater tätig und bekam dann seine erste Professur, seinen ersten Lehrstuhl nicht für Ethnologie, sondern für Kriminologie an der Universität von, helfen Sie mir, please, which university was it? California University. Und wurde dann aber von diesem Lehrstuhl für Recht wegberufen auf eine Professur für Ethnologie an der Universität, die nach wie vor führend ist in der amerikanischen Anthropologie, nämlich an der University of Chicago. Wir hatten ja schon einige Gäste hier im Rahmen unserer Vorlesungen von dort, insbesondere John und Jean Komarov, allerdings schon vor einigen Jahren. Er war hat daneben aber weiterhin auch seine Tätigkeit fortgeführt als Rechtsberater der Hopi, war eine Zeit lang Justice pro tempore am Hopi Appellate Court. Ich sage das hier in Englisch, weil ich nicht die richtige Übersetzung weiß. Appellationsgericht, wahrscheinlich Hopi Appellationsgericht in Arizona, und hat über seine langjährige Arbeit über die Hopi auch ein Buch veröffentlicht, das sehr positiv rezensiert worden ist, Arguing with Tradition, 2008 bei Chicago University Press. Des Weiteren werden von seinen Veröffentlichungen noch zu nennen eine Introduction to Tribal Legal Studies, die in diesem Jahr bereits in 3. Auflage erscheinen wird. Er ist Mitglied in zahlreichen Komitees, die sich mit indigenen Rechtsfragen befassen, und seit einem Jahr erneut Mitglied, und zwar diesmal dauerhaftes Mitglied als Richter im besagten Hopi Appellationsgerichtshof. Ich bin sehr froh, dass er unsere Einladung hierher angenommen hat. Sie hat ja auch noch eine aktuelle kulturpolitische Komponente, nämlich die Auseinandersetzungen über das Humboldt-Forum in Berlin und vor allem auch über die Frage, inwiefern die ethnografischen Bestände, die dort ab 2019 ausgestellt werden sollen, tatsächlich nichts anderes sind als Raubgut und zurückgegeben werden sollen. Um die Frage der Repatriierung, der Legitimität der Forschungen, der Forderungen und natürlich auch der Forschungen zu dieser Frage und über vieles andere mehr werden Sie in den kommenden 6 Wochen hier in der Vorlesung hören zum Thema Repatriating Anthropology.
Dankeschön. Thank you, Professor Dr. Karl-Heinz Kohl, Dr. Markus Lindner, Astrid Hundlik, Sophie Trouville, for helping me to get here. Don't let this suit fool you. I'm very excited to be here. But I must apologize. I'm not Max Ernst. He couldn't be here today. But you have me, Justin Richland. And like I say, I'm very excited. And what I want to do and what I like to do in situations like this is first to give an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to open with some scenes from Native America and pose the question over and over again, what would you want to know about these scenes? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the end and ends of anthropology. Those of you who have been with the Frobenius-Institut and been to these lectures, that may be a familiar title. Then I'm going to turn to what I mean by repatriating anthropology. And finally, I will be sure to self-publicize a little bit and try to encourage you to come to the rest of the lectures. But first, some scenes. Now, in situations like this, in addition to giving you an outline, I always like to start by throwing my audiences, as much as I can, into an ethnographic moment. But before I do that, I should probably ask, how many of you are trained as anthropologists? If you show me with a hand. Okay. How many of you are thinking about training as an anthropologist? Wondering about a career in professional anthropology? And that last category, I mean even the ones who are trained in anthropology who may be wondering about a career in anthropology. Good, I saw one. There's one, I caught one. I asked this question because in many ways, I think being thrown into a moment of ethnography or of ethnographic encounter makes a certain kind of sense to anthropologists or would-be anthropologists in a way that may not make sense to others. The whole point, really, of ethnographic fieldwork, and I think I'm not saying anything controversial here, is, and which I think is still, ethnographic fieldwork, still the defining method of the discipline of anthropology, is to create the conditions of doubt, uncertainty, that comes from consciously knowing that you are entering into a domain of human encounter and activity where your habits of understanding and acting, all your preconceived expectations of how the world is and how it works, may very well be wrong, could potentially be wrong, and thus come up for reconsideration. I want to emphasize that the could potentially be part for reasons that I'll touch upon in greater detail later, but for short, because it is not at all guaranteed that just because your habits of understanding and acting are in such situations could potentially be wrong, it doesn't mean that they are. And the ethnographic context that you find yourself in, that one thrusts themselves into, and the other people and the behaviors that you encounter there, turn out, often enough, to be not nearly as radically different as they might at first seem. And over time, as you stay in the ethnographic contexts you have thrust yourself into, and as this time extends, there is a sense in which these places and spaces and people, and with them yourself, become, in a sense, in relationships of greater familiarity, occasionally punctuated by shifting moments of difference and different layers of familiarity and then difference, in a kind of ebb and flow of understanding what it means to be engaged in the particular moment of social encounter that you are both participating in and observing. And all of this is for the better and for the worse. It's sort of like the difference between a first date with a potential romantic partner and, let's say, the 50th date. Some things have become familiar and understandable, maybe dreadfully so, while others, things can continue to pop up and surprise you. Ethnographic fieldwork is the practice of consciously setting yourself up for such a romance. And I mean romance in both the good and the bad sense. The everyday, the philosophical, and all the other ways in which we can conceptualize what we might mean by being enchanted with and looking at the enchantment of moments of human engagement. So I'm going to try to romance you a bit. See, I can be a good date. And it's going to be a little bit weird, but also hopefully a little bit exciting. And I'm going to do it right now. I want you to ask yourself, what would you want to know to make sense of it's actually 3 scenes of engagement I'm about to share with you? What would make for a good understanding of these moments? And of course, you should be asking yourself already, well, what do you mean by good? Good as in factually accurate, an accurate representation of the scene itself. Good as in responsive and responsible to the values of the people with whom you are engaged, and to your own values. Good as in attending to the uses by and how it's useful to the people in the scene. So keep these in mind and ask yourself these questions as we move through, questions about the empirical, the ethical, and the instrumental. Now, these categories are slippery on purpose. These categories, I use them in a particular way here on purpose, and I look forward to teasing this out over the course of the next 6 weeks with, I hope, all of you, but I won't get my hopes up. And I look forward to thinking with you about where and when these categories work and where and when they don't work. For now, the first scene, a Hopi court hearing of tradition. Already, you have some sense, I think, that this looks like a certain kind of court. So you have some immediate expectations of what this court could be, and some immediate expectations of who these folks are sitting in front of you. But I want to talk about a particular scene, one that happened in 1997, in the early days of my work as a legal researcher. Actually, this event happened before I became an anthropologist, and while I was working for the Hopi court as more or less as a lawyer, doing legal research on issues that eventually would become the subject of my dissertation work and my future books and other publications. I want to point to a specific moment in an inheritance dispute between a Hopi woman and her 3 nieces, her younger sister's 3 daughters. I want to point to this moment in which a Hopi judge is questioning some elders who were called by, who the judge asked the parties to call these elders because he wanted them to testify as to what the customs and traditions of their village were, and specifically the customs and traditions as they applied to this particular case. I'll give you a little bit of background about this case. On the one side, you had this woman who was older than her niece's mother. She got married to a non-Hopi man and left the reservation. She came back and said, I want this plot of land to build a home on so I can retire. And she said, and not only do I want it, it turns out that my father gave it to me before he died in an oral will. The three nieces objected to this. They said, while you were away, their mother took care of this plot of land, and anyway, even if your father had given you this land, men can't give land. That's something that must pass matrilineally. So only mothers can give land to other mothers, and it just so happens our mother gave that land to us. So the judge is asking about one particular element here. How often must a woman who has left her village return, come back, work the land to take care of it, to retain her traditional property rights? And here's the interaction. And I'll do a little reading of it so that you can understand or give a sense for what the Hopi is saying, how it sounds. The judge says, Pam hapipai yap hakam hak ayo, niekyang wa pipai patinut piftung wa. He is saki sen pampa spil pifte, but pai pai tutuikyang wa patut squat. In that manner, someone may go somewhere, but continues to come back regularly. How often must she or he return and still have the rights in that land? And the elder says, well, this one woman, this elder points to the woman in question, says, this one woman never came back frequently. The judge responds, Haki says, wait, by ayanwat as umuy tevingta, by kahaki asitam au susuk aitakya kyangwa, dushta put yu atotan. I asked you in a different way instead. We're not to look at some one person as we talk about this. And then the elder responds, well, I thought we were doing this only for these parties. But now it appears we're doing this for everyone. That is, I thought we were supposed to talk about just how these rules apply to these folks, but now you want us to talk more generally. And the judge says, we're asking for your traditional knowledge. And then a second elder jumps in and says rather curtly, what are you going to do with the village's knowledge? And then says, well, that's something that probably no one will know about. And this threatens to break down the hearing. In fact, for a while it does, and they have to reconvene in a special hearing, and there's lots of disruption and consternation. At one point, one of the elders accuses the judge of being a white man, acting like a white man, and it becomes very heated. What would allow you to have a good understanding of this encounter? And let's go back to the categories I was suggesting. Would you want to know the facts? Sure. Would you want to know what Hopi traditions of inheritance are? How contemporary Hopi court and Hopi law works? How the parties and the judge relate to each other? All seem like relevant questions to ask. But would it be enough to just know the facts? Would it be enough for someone to say, like me, well, the tradition is that women get the homes? I can tell you in this particular case, it didn't get resolved. I can tell you in this particular case, the dispute is ongoing. And it suggests that something else is maybe important here, if in fact it's not simply enough to just make a general blanket statement, here's what the tradition is. So what else? Would you want to know how this hearing ought to be conducted? How Hopi traditions of inheritance should be? How contemporary Hopi court and law should work? I should tell you that these courts are in many ways structured along Anglo-American adversarial style court. It looks like any sort of courtroom drama, Law and Order or something like this in a lot of ways, except that it's happening in Hopi. Does that have an effect? Does that change what someone ought to expect? Interesting, in Anglo-American style courts, judges don't usually question witnesses. Usually the lawyers do. In this particular case, this judge actually said, I am going to question these witnesses, and I have very specific reasons for doing so. And if you stick around for lecture 2, you will understand why that has a dramatic impact on how this case plays itself out. Finally, so now you know maybe what it would be, what not only, let's ask, what are the facts, what this case is, and then, or what the scene is, and also what it ought to be. Is that enough? Maybe we also need to know what in this specific moment between these particular actors is going on. That is, what is their instrumental interests? What is it that they are doing when they are talking about custom and tradition in this way? What is it about Hopi Court that it's being enacted in this way? Why? Why is it important, for example, that the judge would later say, okay, I've now heard the facts, and I don't want you elders to talk about the facts. We've already decided that. Don't talk about the particularities. Just tell us what the abstract rules are. And then the appellate court, the court that I sit on, later said, that's completely reversing the order of things. You have to know the rule first before you can know what facts are relevant. And so it became an incredible problem. Why did he do it that way is also a very interesting question in that particular moment. So we have to ask and be ready to ask not only what this scene is, what it ought to be, and what it is doing in this moment. And those are complex questions. And they are hard to tease out. Scene 2. In the wilderness. Let me go back. We were walking in the Tonto National Forest, and I was there with some Hopi friends, and it was really hot. And we were hiking up to this ridge, and we got to the top, and 5 minutes earlier, these guys were laughing and joking, as Hopi folks like to do. They were teasing each other. They were calling each other every, curse word under the sun. It was very, ribald and crude in the best way possible. And then they became really quiet. And I thought, well, it is kind of hot. Maybe people are just tuckered out, and we did have a nice hike. Then I heard, ish utti, oh my, and kwakwai, kwakwai, thank you, thank you. Now, I probably should have expected that a kind of reverence would break out on that hike. And the reason being is that we were there in a place, like I say, the Tonto National Forest, which is actually right here. And while it is off of about 130 miles south of the current Hopi Indian Reservation, it is still within, very much within, the larger area of Hopi Aboriginal territory. So we were in what the Hopi call Hopitutskwa, our Hopi land. And in fact, this land has all over it ruins, sites, archaeological sites of important significance that have human remains in them, some that don't, still to this day, that have not been interred or disinterred. They haven't been excavated. And where we were in particular was right here, around this area, and it was part of the migration route that is a critical part of Hopi cosmology, an important ceremonial space, part of what the Hopi people call itakuku, our footprints. And we were there because the U.S. Forest Service, which controls this region, this is Forest Service land, had in mind the idea of selling a parcel of land. this parcel of land, the area called Payson Ranger District. Now, in order to sell land, for it to go out of federal control into private hands, they are required, under the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, to consult. Especially in this case, because if they were going to sell this land, the archaeologist said, they were going to have to excavate the sites rapidly. And in order to excavate a site that may or may not be of cultural significance, of ritual significance, under the law, federal law, they are required, in the case of unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, to consult with the Indian tribe, which has closest cultural affiliation, because it is presumptively theirs. And in fact, if you don't consult, it can result in an arrest or fine and effectively be a kind of grave digging, pot stealing, other sorts of nefarious activities that a number of different laws have been passed in the United States to protect against. So the Hopi were down there to consult. And they were there to consult not only about what to do with regard to these sites on this parcel of land that was going to be sold, but also to help the archaeologists make the case to the people who are selling the money, who are spending the money, who are going to give them money to do the excavation. In order for the archaeologists to get federal money, government money, to do the excavation, they have to justify the excavation of an area that could potentially be on the National Registry of Historic Places. And there are certain rules of eligibility for how sites can qualify or be eligible. In essence, the federal law requires there be a significance to this site. A significance, and this is quoting the law itself, in American history, the quality of significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture is present in these sites, structures, and objects if they are associated with events that made a contribution to our history, or they are associated with persons significant in our past, or they embody the distinctive characteristics of a type or work of a master, and finally, if they are likely to yield information important to our past. So what these elders, what these Hopi folks were brought down there to do, and they are members of what's called the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, or HCPO, the office that's in charge of engagements around NAGPRA-related issues, repatriation issues. They were being asked, are these sites significant? Do they meet these criteria? And so an archaeologist asked this very question. At one of the pictures I just showed you, he asked, so if we think about the National Register criteria for eligibility, and that being its important events in the past, any important people or individuals, the work of a master, a unique construction, and also providing information of the past, those are the 4 criteria of eligibility. What criteria would this meet of those? And of course, the Hopi man said, it would meet all of them. And the archaeologist said, all of them? All of them, yeah. Then at the next site, the same question, is this also a very important place? Yeah, a very important place. I really want to say that these things aren't just put there, they're put in a sacred sense. So this won't be bothered, won't destroy it. There's a lot of spots out in Hopi right now that are still like that. So if we spoke in terms of eligibility, like we did before, would this meet all of the criteria as well? Yeah. So we're good with the criteria, except that the Hopi went back feeling that they had established the significance of these sites and that therefore what their recommendation in their report to the Forest Service was, in fact, not to disturb these sites at all. The Hopi tribe considers all sites of the project area to be Hopi ancestral sites and traditional cultural properties, and avoidance of adverse effects is recommended. That was the recommendation that the tribe made. The archaeologists decided that there was a finding of no significant impact as a possibility of selling this land, and went ahead and did it. What happened? How do we understand it? I can tell you how the Hopi understood it. The director of the Cultural Preservation Office was really fed up. In fact, asked, why are we even doing these consultations if, in the end, what it really seems to be about is to give these guys the rubber stamp under the law so that they can go and do whatever they're going to do anyway? Now, my question to you as an anthropologist or as an ethnographer is that what's going on here? Is that a good understanding? Or maybe is something else afoot? Maybe a misunderstanding that requires some good understanding that involves a negotiation between the empirical, the ethical, and the instrumental, and how those three come into play. Finally, the third scene. This is a team that went to the Field Museum in Chicago. Have any of you ever been to the Field Museum in Chicago? It has probably the largest and most important collection of Hopi material culture outside of the Hopi Reservation, or outside of Arizona probably. Certainly one of the oldest. It ranks with the Smithsonian and probably is better. In fact, it has one of the largest Native American collections, and of their collections of different Native American tribes, Hopi is the largest tribal group represented. And so they regularly do NAGPRA consultations in which they are required under law periodically to inventory their lists of collected items, send it to the tribe, and if the tribe has any interest, to come back and to meet with them to look at, describe, evaluate what these pieces are. And they've been doing this for about 10 years, and here you have some Hopi guys who are helping with some testing of some pieces, testing their toxicity with various heavy metals and preservatives that were used on these pieces a long time ago. They're getting into it. They're on the computer, and they're shooting the gun, and they're excited. If you go down into the collection storage center, this spectacular collection storage center that was opened in 2005 in the Field Museum, it's a subterranean center. It was opened to the tune of, I think, $25 million. It was an enormous endeavor. That's why they're in a lot of trouble financially right now, actually, as they're still paying this off. But it's a spectacular site, and you would come across rows and rows of astounding ethnographic material. When you found your way eventually to the Hopi, though, you might be surprised both by what you don't see and by what you do. In fact, if you found yourself at the Hopi site, you may not even know you were there. All of the materials, even down in the subterranean collections, have been closed off from casual sight and from professional sight, even by the curators. In fact, curators there have to get permission from the tribe in order to access these sites. Very often, many of these pieces this is not according to the law, this is according to how the museum itself has decided to run its operation. They collaborate, and there are pieces that say male handling only, female handling only. So the reasons for why these things are secluded and sequestered have a lot to do with Hopi expectations about how these materials are to be handled. But I think as much as what is missing, what's significant here is what is not. And if you look on that placard, you will see a single feather hanging. That is a Hopi prayer feather. And when I asked one of the curators about it, they said, well, the Hopi team was here, and they asked if they could put it there as a reminder to the beings that are there that they are thinking of them, that they have them in their hearts, and that they wish them well, and that they are keeping a lookout for them, which is what these prayer feathers, these pajos, do in all contexts, everywhere that they are used. They're sometimes used on the hair of men who have gone through ritual, who are in the middle of ritual ceremonies. They're on katsinam, the friends who dance, the ancestor spirits. And it's here instead of the name, Hopi. The thing is, I asked, so that piece, did you accession it into your collection? And the curator said, well, no. Why would we? So what does it mean that that piece is allowed to hang there, to abide, according to what ethical obligation? What does it stand for when it's not part of the collection and yet inside the institution? What does it mean about how and whether and the extent to which this space may very well be partly now some sort of Hopi normative space, ethical space, instrumental space? How can we understand these quiet moments? And quietude is really important for Hopi. Very often the most significant aspects of their religion are things that you would pass right by. You wouldn't attend to factively as anything relevant, and they wouldn't want you to. So I would suggest that what you would want to know about all of these scenes is not just what these sites factually are to you or to them. You would want to know what these sites should be, that is, how much do they live up to or not live up to expectations of responsibility by and between the actors themselves that you're observing and you and them? And finally, how are these actors themselves doing things with these engagements, with these encounters? What do they mean in the specificity of that moment in a political and historical context in which it's in, and social context? I think we start to approach a sense of the complexity of an ethnographic encounter, of the complexity of the empirics and ethics of anthropology, when we remind ourselves that we hold in abeyance our preconceptions, possibly, because possibly they might be wrong, and we invite the opportunity to think otherwise and with those with whom we engage in all these different domains. Let me turn now to talking a little bit about how this relates more broadly to questions that are pressing in anthropology. Now, I have a confession to make. When I wrote the abstract for this piece, I was keenly interested in telling a story of the way in which my engagements with various folks in Native America and my understanding of what anthropology is have both grown out of and really don't quite fit the image of anthropology as a discipline in crisis. And it was only later, when I started to really prepare for these lectures, that I realized, oh, some folks have already been talking about that here. In fact, an entire series of lectures in 2008 were dedicated to the question of the end of anthropology. And not only that, but a wonderful edited volume came out, which meant I could access these papers quite readily. Actually, they were in the journal published by the Frobenius-Institut before the book, so there's several different iterations. If I couldn't find the book, I could find the journal. I was going to get these things. And they're wonderful. They're wonderful lectures that I think capture very much some of the concerns and some of the issues that I wanted to talk about today. And in fact, I was particularly struck by Vincent Crapazzano's conceptualization of the end and ends of anthropology, or the ends of anthropology. And this, in English, this play on words, this idea that there is an end as the final element or the edge of something, but also its goal, its telos, what it is designed to do. And I think those two things are keenly and deeply connected in anthropology. I was also struck by Holger Jeben's wonderful piece in which he describes really that anthropology has kind of always been in crisis. The whole history of the discipline can indeed be described as a history of dangers and threats. And he goes on to suggest many different reasons why this is. But before doing that, he points out that there, in fact, have been 3 phases of crisis in anthropology. The first phase, the classical anthropological phase, the folks like Franz Boas and Bronislaw Malinowski and Adolf Bastian and almost everyone you could possibly name that you could remember of those old fogies, those old guys, all bemoaned the impending loss of the discipline because it was losing its object of study. Right? If we remember Franz Boas's conceptualization of anthropology as a salvage anthropology, the whole point was that the folks whose lives we were describing, those lives were going away and we were there to preserve them, which ultimately meant that anthropology would write itself out of business. There was a second phase that is in some ways related, but in some ways has an interesting sort of self-reflection and turn on this idea of writing ourselves out of business. And this was a phase that came about in the 80s, in the early 70s, in the mid-70s as well, the so-called writing culture phase, which is made famous by George Marcus and his colleagues, James Clifford. If you guys have read any of this, you'll know that this is a very familiar idea in anthropology, that our ethnographic writings essentially have more in common with fiction than they do with an accurate representation of truths on the ground. That we produce our others, and so we shouldn't be worried about them, about them dying away, because we'll just make some more in our writings. And the critique was ultimately that what kind of claim to objectivity can we make? What kind of claim to scientific validity can we make? And maybe, if that's in fact what we're doing, playing with tropes and forms of textual flourish, and maybe that shouldn't be the project anyway. Maybe we should be engaged in something else. Maybe we should be engaged in a much more critical, political encounter and project. And that then corresponded to and really sort of followed on the heels of another crisis, a crisis of authority. And that crisis emerged out of the growing, the sort of maturation of the post-colonial era, the end and decolonization of many of the global countries in the global south, where anthropology first cut its teeth, and the recognition that folks in these communities and in these places where we've been writing about for many years have something to say about themselves and have a sense of their political commitment to their own expression of their own identities and their own histories and their own political futures. That is, they're neither nearly as isolated, nor nearly as dead, nor nearly as backwards as others would have them be, and they're here to tell us about it. And so, in a wonderful turn of phrase from some post-colonial theory from the, I think it was in the 80s, the story of the empire writes back is a nice play on terms that I wanted to bring forth here. Now, my training in anthropology comes, in some ways, responds. I grew up as an anthropologist in the heat of these moments, in the 80s and 90s. And so in many ways, the choices I made after law school, when I decided to come back to anthropology, were deeply informed by each one of these. They were deeply informed by legal anthropology's own particular crises. The famous debate between Max Glckman and Paul Bohannon in the 50s and 60s, which was a debate over whether or not, how was the best way to represent concepts of law, ideas of law, practices, or theories of law that come from non-Western societies. Can we use European, Euro-American concepts to describe the laws of people like the Tiv or the Barotse? Is it valid, accurate to refer to the Barotse as having a concept of a reasonable man, which is a concept in Anglo-American jurisprudence or English jurisprudence, common law jurisprudence? Can we talk about contracts? Should we be talking about contracts? In India, for example, pre-colonial India. Bohannon, on the other hand, Glckman felt that you could, Bohannon said you couldn't, and in fact he said, I don't even want to translate the concepts in the Barotse concepts, the Tiv concepts. I want to represent them in my ethnographies as just the terms that they use, and I won't even define them, which made for really kind of lousy reading, actually. Hard to get a handle on what it is that he's talking about. This debate actually was sidestepped more than resolved. Laura Nader, a wonderful anthropologist, a legal anthropologist at University of California, Berkeley, and I don't know, is anyone familiar with the Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader in the US? His older sister. And she's more fiery than he is. She's great. She said, oh, why even bother with this question of what law is? Who cares? We know that people are fighting, and we know that people are resolving fights. Let's go look at those practices and describe them as they play out. So it inaugurated a whole shift to process and practice as the mode in which we pursue an understanding of the legal, which became quite popular in the work of people like Sally Falk Moore, John Komaroff, and many others, Sally Engel-Mary, and deeply informed my own ideas of how one should go about studying law and its place in the world. In fact, the idea that process and practice are important compelled me to go to linguistic anthropology. Why? Well, as a trained lawyer in the common law system, I became keenly aware of how important language was, and particularly how important oral argument, how important courtroom discourse, how important various kinds of argumentation, negotiation, resolution, and description and ordering became. And so I became really interested in and taking seriously the so-called turn to language that happened in a lot of critical theory at the time and was also happening in anthropology. In fact, the idea of culture as text and writing culture became for linguistic anthropology, which is a relatively small subfield. Actually, in the American system, it's considered an entirely separate subfield from cultural anthropology. It's one of the four: archaeology, cultural, linguistic, sociocultural, linguistic, and physical. And so in the Boasian tradition, it's really, we're like the smallest, most ignored group of anthropologists, though we're making a strong claim these days. And I became interested because I really wanted to understand how language was being used empirically to do the kinds of things that Clifford Geertz was talking about when he described culture as text, when Marcus was talking about how we use language to produce and construct narratives. I wanted to understand, and so do linguistic anthropologists, how language emerges, language use is deployed in the everyday interactions between people in places we go and work, as they negotiate and interact with each other in building up social orders, cultural orders, in taking social action and constituting together social meanings. This became critical and critically interesting to me, and it was taking seriously the idea that culture is not some static thing, but it is constantly being produced and negotiated by the folks with whom we are studying, and more importantly, or perhaps most importantly, that social actors themselves, the folks we study, are as interested and concerned with what is going on, with how to have a good understanding of what is happening, as we are. So that maybe it makes sense for us to be attending to the ways in which they are making their good understandings of what's going on in their moments. So our questions can be their questions for different purposes and to different ends, but we can attend to not just the way people talk, but the way people think about the way people talk, the way they talk. What sometimes is referred to as meta-pragmatics or meta-discourse by my colleagues at the University of Chicago. And this, at the end of the day, has an instrumental dimension because when people are gauging each other about what it is that they're doing when they're talking to each other, they start to wonder about how to move next. What's the next thing I need to do? That person said hello to me. Do I say hello or don't I say hello? Or, more importantly, that person didn't say hello when I walked by. What's going on here? Are they mad at me? Maybe they didn't hear me? Maybe they're just rude? These kinds of instrumental questions are not just questions in the abstract. They're questions for how shall I act next? So in all of these ways, we have to think about these different dimensions together. And linguistic anthropology, as you can tell, my interest and concern with language is centrally attuned to these kinds of questions, not just at the empirical or ethical level, but also at the instrumental. And finally, my concern with Native America, and I think those of you, anyone here from American Studies who is interested in Native America? Anyone who's in anthropology interested in Native America? Marcus should raise his hand. Yes, Suzanne should raise her hand. Yeah, so these issues are going to be familiar. They're critically important from the perspective of Native American folks. A robust argument is made that Native peoples have been all but erased, largely by the representations of their culture as static, as in the past firmly, as not active and alive and growing today, so that they are actively concerned with still being seen as still being here and having something to say about it. That not only are they still here, but they're still here in ways that are cultural, that are developing, and that are neither dead nor static. The story of their demise has been greatly exaggerated, to quote the line about Samuel Clemens. Mark Twain wrote that when he found out his own obituary was published. He wrote to the editor of the newspaper and said, the story of my demise has been greatly exaggerated. I always thought that would be a great thing to do. Anyway, not only are they interested in this, not only do they want to establish that they are still growing, still changing, but that they have a right to and interest in uses for their culture, their history, and their own self-representations, both on their own terms and in negotiation with others. And here we can have classic work like that of Vine Deloria, Custer Died for Your Sins, Gerald Visner, Survivance, Taikaki Alfred more recently, and the great Audra Simpson, who wrote a book called Mohawk Interruptus, which I recommend to all of you. So what does this all mean for repatriating anthropology? We have these crises. We have these crises as they shape the way I do my work. I take seriously Crapanzano's invitation to develop theories and interpretive strategies that arise from the betwixt and between from which our research proceeds. I also take seriously the idea that Holger Jebens offered us in the same volume, that anthropology doesn't have an identity crisis. Crisis is its identity. And that it makes use of crisis. He says anthropologists who believe they are in a precarious situation identify themselves with the people with whom they work. Perceptions of other and self influence each other not only in the history of the discipline, but also in the field, when social reality, by offering a certain resistance, can force anthropologists to face and modify their preconceived ideas and expectations. Back to what my first point was about throwing you into the deep end, what anthropology does methodologically as a point of intentional interference with itself is throws ourselves into crisis, culture shock, whatever you want to call it, in the ethnographic moment, precisely to have crises of objects, precisely to have crises of subjectivity, precisely to have crises of authority. And so it behooves us, in one way or another, to turn the question of those crises, the concern with being in crisis, into questions about what can we factually know, what can we ethically appreciate, and what can we instrumentally do. And I think that when we turn our crises into questions, we turn what feels like a threat into a possibility. So what will proceed from here, these lectures that I will give over the next few weeks, will be sitting at the intersection, I think, as you can already see, between legal, linguistic, and Native American anthropology, as I have done it over the past 20 years of my career. These lectures will use insights and perspectives from one domain of the legal, the linguistic, or the Native American to speak to reflect on, and challenge the assumptions and conclusions of the others. That is essentially to do my best to throw crises all over the place. These lectures will argue that, at least for anthropology, a good understanding of events of human social action and meaning as they unfold may require that we understand them as shaped by their various epistemological, normative, and political dimensions all at once, and that they blur into each other. And it's our job to both tease them out and then to mess them up again. Dimensions that I, again, am calling the empirical, the ethical, and the instrumental. And that each of these dimensions informs the others invariably in some way or another. We'll look at scenes from across Native America to understand that the crises of anthropology's past and present are ones that will likely always be with us so long as we engage in the work of ethnographic participation and observation. But it's not just the challenge to anthropology, it's also its promise. And so it is this that I am suggesting we think of as the possibility of and for repatriating anthropology. Now, I promised a schedule of the lectures. You got through this one. Only 5 more to go. Next week, I'll be talking about the case that I described in the first instance, and we'll get into more detail about it, and about the ways in which epistemology and what can be known and not known out from a Hopi perspective echoes, reflects, and stands as the ground for how Hopi people understand the relationships of what about their culture can be known by non-Hopis. And that's an important insight that we have to attend to. And that's called What Are You Going to Do with the Village's Knowledge? Hopi Sovereignty as Epistemological Limit. I'm then going to turn to the cases that I talked a little bit about in the Tonto National Forest. And I'm going to talk about what I'm calling Hopi jurisdiction. And I mean it as a play on the term. There's been recent work on jurisdiction that not only thinks of it as a spatial relationship in which the scope of authority is exercised, but jurisdictio, the speaking of law. And of course, for someone who does linguistic anthropology and law, I couldn't resist. So we'll talk a little bit about what it can mean to talk law into being and how that has ethical, authoritative, and empirical dimensions in the context of those cases, of those interactions with the archaeologists that I was talking about before. Then we'll get into some new territory that you haven't seen yet. The fourth lecture will be on perpetuity. This is an attempt, if jurisdiction is about the language of a kind of legal space, perpetuity, which is a concept in English, in Anglo-American law, which is a great concept about temporality. It's a great concept precisely because it is one of the hardest to understand, and in fact, in the state of California, a lawyer who violates the rule against perpetuities cannot be held for malpractice. The court said, even the best lawyers can't understand what the hell a perpetuity is or what the rule against perpetuities is. I take this and play with it in thinking about how law, legality, authority, normativity have a kind of temporality and a temporal expanse that reveals itself in language in productive ways. I'll then turn in the second to last lecture to some other sites where I've done some more preliminary work. This one will look at a site, and maybe 2 sites, where federal agents are engaged with Native nations seeking certain kinds of legal recognition. One in particular is this Bureau of, the Bureau of Indian Affairs has an Office of Federal Acknowledgement, a process by which Native nations who are not recognized by the U.S. government can get recognition. And I was fortunate enough to collect some audio recordings that a tribe that was going through this process had made of some meetings with the lawyers from the office. And it's very illuminating to look precisely at the ways in which they account and it becomes important to make sense of who is and who isn't Native. And then I'll end with some larger reflections about the role that listening, the role that hearing, and its limits can play in the context of working in Native America and maybe beyond for repatriating anthropology. And if I don't say it enough, I'll let Max Ernst say it. Thank you very much.